It started with a lake, a view, and a piece of land that had been in the Hendricks family for generations. Long before anyone had ever thought to put a name like Lakeview Reserve HOA on it. James Hendricks had grown up fishing that lake, with his grandfather, building forts in the woods that edged the shoreline, and learning how to skip rocks across the water's glassy surface before he could even read. The land wasn't just property, it was legacy. When he inherited the house from his father, along with the few remaining acres of shoreline, he promised himself he'd never let anyone mess with it. But promises made on peaceful mornings with loons calling in the distance don't stand a chance when someone like Elaine Tucker steps into your life. Elaine, the newly elected president of the Lakeview Reserve Homeowners Association, came armed with pastel-colored pantsuits, legal pads, and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. From the moment she arrived, she was on a mission to beautify and standardize the neighborhood. As if the century-old trees and the creaky wooden docks were offensive to her sensibilities. James had been civil at first, when she introduced herself at the community picnic and handed him a copy of the HOA rules van. Though his property technically bordered the development and wasn't part of it, he'd thanked her and tucked it into his back pocket, intending to throw it away later. But the first letter came 2 days after he replaced a broken section of his fence with rough-cut cedar, the same kind his grandfather had used. The envelope was stamped with the H gold crest and contained a violation notice claiming non-compliant materials visible from shared community paths. James laughed and tossed it, assuming it was a mistake. The second letter was hand-delivered by a man in a blue polo who looked terrified to be there. This time the notice referenced his dock, which had existed for over 50 years, now suddenly described as an unapproved extension into shared lakefront property. James called the number on the letter, got voicemail, and left a message that started polite and ended with frustration. He never got a call back. But the third notice showed up 3 days later with a fine attached to $150 for unresolved violations. That was when James realized Elaine wasn't playing games. He drove to the HOA office, a renovated guest house near the neighborhood's front gate, and walked straight in without knocking. Elaine sat behind a whitewashed desk, her hair pulled tight, her eyes scanning him like he was an uninvited guest at her private gala. "Mr. Hendricks, I assume you're here about the fines," she said, not bothering to stand. "I'm here to tell you that I don't answer to your board," he replied. "My land was here before your HOA even existed. It's not part of your jurisdiction." Elaine smiled tightly. "There's been some confusion. Your property borders shared community amenities, and we've had legal review suggesting that any visible structures impacting communal aesthetics fall under our purview." James stared at her. "Communal aesthetics? That dock was here when your so-called community was just a dirt road and some survey flags." She stood slowly, walking to a file cabinet and pulling out a manila folder. "The lines are blurry, Mr. Hendricks. We can resolve this amicably if you're willing to cooperate. Perhaps you'd consider joining the HOA voluntarily. There are benefits, community events, shared maintenance, voting privileges. I'm not interested in HOA bake sales," he said, turning on his heel and leaving. But as he walked out, Elaine called after him, "Refusing to participate doesn't exempt you from community standards." The words stuck in his head like a splinter. Over the next few weeks, the notices kept coming, new complaints about his lawn height, the angle of his mailbox, even the color of his curtains, which were apparently jarringly inconsistent with neighborhood harmony. He ignored them, then challenged them, then tried to have a civil meeting with the board. But Elaine controlled the board like a puppet master, and at every turn he found himself outnumbered, overruled, or dismissed. Then came the day he found a crew standing on his dock with clipboards and measuring tape. "We're doing a compliance survey," one of them explained. "HOA requested updated property evaluations." James lost it. "This is my dock, my property. Get off it before I call the sheriff." The men backed off, muttering apologies, but it was clear they were just following orders. That night, James started digging. He pulled out every deed, plat, map, and survey his family had kept. His land, his shoreline, and his dock were clearly within the bounds of his title. No shared easements, no covenants, no gray areas. Armed with documentation, he filed a formal complaint with the county, requesting clarification. But before he could get a reply, things escalated. The following week, he came home from the grocery store to find his mailbox smashed, a spray-painted warning on the side of his garage that read "HOA means everyone," and a citation taped to his door fining him for failure to maintain harmonious property standards. He filed a police report, but nothing came of it. The officer who showed up said it was probably kids. James wasn't so sure. He installed cameras, 6 of them hid in birdhouses, eaves, and even under the dock. He started recording everything. Days later, his truck tires were slashed. The footage showed 2 hooded figures, but their faces were never clear. Elaine, of course, denied any involvement when he confronted her. "That sounds terrible," she said with mock concern. "But surely you can't believe a community organization would sanction such behavior." "All I know is, none of this started until you showed up," he growled. She tilted her head. "Maybe it's the community responding to disruption. People don't like feeling disrespected." That was when James knew this was war. He hired A land use attorney uploaded every incident to a private cloud and started documenting Elaine's every move. But she wasn't done either. The next letter that arrived wasn't a citation, it was a lawsuit. The HOA was suing James for violating architectural standards, encroaching on common space, and creating a hostile environment. The complaint claimed damages, legal fees, and demanded he remove his dock, repaint his house, and join the HOA retroactively. James sat at his kitchen table staring at the papers for a long time before picking up the phone. He called his cousin, a retired judge, who read the complaint and said, "They're trying to bankrupt you with paper. It's a strategy. Flood you with legal action until you give up or settle." But James wasn't the settling type. He went public. He posted a video showing the damage, the citations, the surveillance footage. He outlined the timeline, the harassment, the legal threats. It went viral locally, then regionally. People started sharing their own HOA horror stories. News outlets picked it up. Reporters showed up at his driveway. HOA versus homeowner. The battle for the lake read one headline. And in the middle of the storm, Elaine stood at a podium during an emergency HOA meeting, claiming James was endangering the community, spreading misinformation, and defaming good people trying to uphold order. But the tide had shifted. Neighbors, who had quietly supported James, began speaking up. "They fined me $150 for planting sunflowers," one woman said. "I got cited for letting my dog outside without a designer leash," another man added. The illusion of control cracked. And James, he kept going. He filed countersuits, requested audits, and demanded Elaine produce the legal documents supporting her claims of jurisdiction. When the court finally reviewed the case, they found James was right. His land was outside HOA bounds. His dock, fence, and house were entirely on private, exempt property. The lawsuit was dismissed. The fines were voided. The judge scolded the HOA for overreach, but Elaine still wouldn't back down. "He undermined our community," she told the local news. "There should be consequences." But there were consequences, just not the ones she expected. The state launched an investigation into the HOA's practices. Elaine was removed from the board pending review. James didn't celebrate. He went down to the lake, sat on the end of his dock, and watched the sun go down just like he used to with his grandfather. He'd won the battle, but he knew it wasn't over. Not yet. James Hendricks had expected peace after the court ruling, or at the very least silence. But what he received was a more insidious kind of retaliation, quiet resistance, veiled threats, and a rising tide of pettiness disguised as protocol. Elaine Tucker may have been suspended pending investigation, but her shadow still lingered through her loyalists on the HOA board, who began finding new ways to make James's life miserable. 1 week after the lawsuit was dismissed, James received a notice from the city's code enforcement officer, formal citation for unauthorized land development due to a compost bin he had built years ago behind his shed. The timing was far too convenient. He contested it, but by then more city inspections had mysteriously begun to appear on his property. Someone was digging through records, feeding complaints through channels outside the HOA. He suspected Elaine, even in absence, was still pulling strings. He installed additional cameras, reviewed footage daily, and began noticing familiar vehicles making slow passes in front of his home. On one occasion, a car parked across from his house for over 30 minutes. When James approached, the driver quickly pulled away, but not before James got a partial license plate number. He filed yet another police report, but there was little they could do without evidence of criminal activity. The slow psychological wear began to creep in: paranoia, fatigue, the sense of always being watched. He tried to maintain a routine: morning coffee, walk to the dock, some repairs around the house. But everywhere he turned, there were reminders of the battles still smoldering beneath the surface. Neighbors were divided. Some avoided eye contact. Others waved a little too cheerfully, as if overcompensating for something they didn't want to say. One afternoon, James found a note taped to his front door. It read, "You might have won in court, but this neighborhood doesn't forget." There was no signature, but the handwriting was sharp, blocky, and angry. He added it to the growing pile of documentation. Meanwhile, the investigation into the HOA gained momentum. A surprise audit revealed tens of thousands of dollars in questionable spending payments to companies with no valid tax ID numbers, vague expenses labeled as beautification, and travel reimbursements that raised eyebrows. Elaine, now officially removed from the board, hired her own attorney and went on the defensive, claiming she was being scapegoated by the city for trying to uphold decency. The board, in an attempt to distance themselves, released a formal statement disavowing her actions and promising reform. But those same board members had signed off on the very policies under scrutiny, and James had the records to prove it. He compiled a detailed timeline, linked citations, and public posts, and published it as an open letter to the community. The document spread quickly, not only in Lakeview Reserve, but to surrounding neighborhoods dealing with their own HOA nightmares. James had unwittingly become a symbol, a kind of folk hero for homeowners tired of being micromanaged by people. With power complexes and clipboards, reporters returned. this time for long-form interviews. A documentary team asked to shadow him for a short film on HOA abuse across the country. James declined the camera crew but agreed to an audio interview. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, just a man telling his story. "I didn't want to be the face of anything," he said. "I just wanted to sit on my dock and drink my coffee in peace, but even peace was hard-earned." At night, he still heard noises rustling near the tree line. Distant footsteps, the occasional snap of a twig that sent adrenaline coursing through his veins. He began keeping a flashlight and a bat near his door, and on particularly restless nights, he sat in his truck with the engine off, watching the road. One night, just past 2 a.m., his cameras caught movement 3 figures, approaching the dock, 2 of them holding something metallic. He triggered the floodlights remotely, blinding the intruders, who stumbled and fled. The video was grainy, but one wore a hoodie with a distinct emblem and HOA volunteer jacket from last year's community cleanup. James sent the footage to the sheriff's office. A deputy responded and promised to follow up, but nothing came of it. That was the moment James realized that justice, while available in courtrooms, was much harder to enforce on suburban sidewalks. He began logging every single event with timestamps, screenshots, cross-referenced data. He built a digital archive that backed it up to multiple drives and shared it with a few trusted allies in case something ever happened to him. The war was no longer about one man versus one woman. It was about principle, about boundaries, about who had the right to dictate how another person lived on land they legally owned. The state's Department of Consumer Protection opened a case file and began interviewing residents, starting with James and moving through others who had filed complaints. Patterns emerged: fines issued without board votes, surveillance used without consent, retaliation tactics for anyone who questioned authority. Elaine's defense began to crack. One of her former board members turned whistleblower, providing emails that showed she had personally ordered fines, written threatening letters, and falsified meeting minutes to suggest community approval. James read those emails and felt no joy, only a deep, hollow sense that the damage he had done ran much deeper than he ever saw. The lake, once a place of solace, became the symbol of everything he was fighting to protect. He invited the state investigator to meet him there. They walked the shoreline, reviewed old photos, and stood together on the dock as James explained how each plank had been replaced by hand, how the dock had been there long before the HOA was even conceived. "This isn't just wood," James said. "It's memory, and no committee vote should have the power to erase that." The investigator nodded, visibly moved, and promised to include it in the report. Meanwhile, Elaine vanished from public view. Her home went up for sale. Rumors swirled about pending charges. A few loyalists tried to keep her legacy alive by hosting informal HOA meets, but no one showed. James, weary but resolute, continued to live as he always had, fixing things, fishing the lake, sharing stories with the few neighbors who still came by. Then came the knock on the door. A man in a suit, badge clipped to his belt. "Federal investigator." He introduced himself and explained that the HOA's behavior, including the pattern of citations, surveillance, and potential mail fraud, who had triggered interest beyond the state level. James was asked to provide testimony for a broader probe into HOA abuse nationally. He agreed, quietly, without fanfare, just another entry in the long timeline of standing his ground. And yet, with every step forward, he never let his guard down. Peace, for James Hendricks, had become an act of defiance, a form of resistance, and he was willing to fight for it with everything he had. By the time federal investigators started requesting testimony from residents of Lakeview Reserve and surrounding communities, James Hendricks had become more than a reluctant participant in a local power struggle. He was now a key witness in what was shaping up to be one of the largest inquiries into homeowners association abuse the state had ever seen. The files he had meticulously compiled over months, the surveillance footage, the printed letters, citations, voice memos, and even fragments of threatening notes became primary evidence in a growing case of civil intimidation, mail fraud, misappropriation of community funds, and unlawful use of authority. James spent several long days at the county courthouse providing testimony under oath, detailing how Elaine Tucker and her loyalists had turned what should have been a peaceful HOA into a petty dictatorship. The officials interviewing him were shocked by the depth of the manipulation, especially when James handed over physical copies of board meeting notes ones the HOA had previously claimed didn't exist, showing votes that had never actually happened. Everything was scripted, James told them. Meetings were a formality. She made the decisions before she even stepped into the room. But even as the investigation gained traction, Elaine's influence hadn't entirely disappeared. A few of her supporters, including a former treasurer and an aggressive enforcement officer named Don Sellers, began showing up at James's property uninvited. One afternoon, Don stood at the tree line near the edge of the lake, pretending to inspect the community boundary markers. James called out from his dock, "Step 1 foot on this property and I'll file a restraining order before dinner." Don didn't reply, but he didn't move either. He just stood there with a clipboard, sunglasses hiding his expression, before turning and walking away. The next morning, a large dead fish was nailed to the front of James's shed. The message was obvious, but James didn't flinch. He called the authorities, submitted a report, added the photo to his growing archive, and installed an additional camera aimed directly at the shed. He was done giving them reactions. They wanted him agitated, on edge, emotional. But James had learned that calm, measured action was what really unnerved people like Elaine and her cronies. That week, James got a call from a woman named Laura Dennis, a former HOA board member who had resigned quietly just before the first lawsuit was filed. She asked if they could meet privately. They chose a coffee shop on the far side of the county, where she arrived in a hoodie and sunglasses, visibly nervous. "They threatened me," she whispered, sipping tea with trembling hands. "Told me if I spoke out, I'd be fined into the ground. I had to move my mother out of the neighborhood because they cited her for leaving her trash bin out 5 minutes. Past collection." Laura handed James a flash drive, meeting recordings, emails, everything I saved before I quit. When James reviewed the contents, his heart raced. There were full recordings of HOA board meetings where Elaine openly discussed retaliating against residents who didn't comply. One clip captured her saying, "If we find them long enough, they'll either move or fold." Another showed her directing the board to target non-contributing homeowners, people like James who weren't paying dues because they legally weren't part of the HOA. James handed the drive to the investigators the next morning. Days later, subpoenas were issued to remaining board members, and a temporary injunction was placed on the HOA's enforcement activities until the investigation concluded. The news exploded. Headlines ran stories with titles like "HOA Tyranny," "Unmasked," and "Whistleblowers Detail Suburban Corruption." James's face was everywhere again, though he avoided cameras and refused interviews. Reporters camped out at the entrance to the Lakeview Reserve community, snapping photos of HOA board members as they were served legal documents. Meanwhile, Elaine remained hidden. Her house was vacant, her mail piling up, her name whispered in gas station aisles like some disgraced political figure. But despite the silence, James knew better than to assume she was done. That belief was confirmed when, one night, his mailbox exploded, literally. A small pipe bomb, poorly made, but dangerous enough, was placed inside and detonated around 3 a.m., waking the neighborhood with a thunderous crack. Police cordoned off the property, investigators swarmed the area, and James watched from his porch, jaw clenched, shotgun within reach. No one was hurt, but the message couldn't have been clearer. The feds took the attack seriously. Within 48 hours, James was assigned a protective detail. Unmarked cars began rotating outside his home, and his phone was outfitted with a direct emergency response line. "We're escalating into criminal territory," one agent told him. "You've rattled someone who still has reach." For James, it wasn't fear that set in, but a deeper, colder determination. He knew now that this was no longer about violations or boundaries. This was about control, and his refusal to surrender had exposed how fragile that control really was. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a paper trail of illegal surveillance orders, cameras installed without consent, GPS tracking devices found on vehicles, and even one bizarre case where a resident's phone data had been accessed through a spoofed HOA network. Every new detail added weight to James's case and further discredited Elaine and her board. Meanwhile, support for James poured in from around the country. Homeowners from as far as Oregon and Maine sent letters, emails, and small gifts, handmade, signs that said "We stand with James," coffee mugs with "HOA free forever," and one particularly heartfelt letter from an elderly couple in Tennessee who had lost their home to aggressive fines. "You're fighting for all of us," they wrote. James, touched but private as ever, kept the letters in a shoebox under his bed. He didn't want celebrity, he wanted peace. But even as legal momentum surged, the mental toll was undeniable. James started waking up at odd hours, haunted by every knock, every shadow, every suspicious car. He kept a sidearm on his nightstand. His friends urged him to move, to sell the house and start fresh somewhere else. But he refused. "If I leave, they win," he said, "and then they'll just do it to someone else." He poured his energy into preparing for trial, working closely with investigators, attorneys, and whistleblowers. Every day, new pieces of the puzzle emerged: proof of altered property maps, deleted vote records, HOA meeting scripts prepared in advance to ensure Elaine always had the final word. It was all unraveling. A special hearing was scheduled for mid-June where the judge would decide whether to formally dissolve the Lakeview Reserve HOA under the state's Emergency Authority Clause. James prepared a statement for that hearing, one he wrote at his kitchen table over the course of 3 sleepless nights. It wasn't angry or vengeful, it was reflective. Communities should be built on respect, not rules, on conversation, not citations. "I've lived here my whole life and I've watched something beautiful get twisted into something bitter. I'm not here to destroy an HOA. I'm here to remind you that people matter more than power." When he finished reading it aloud in the courtroom, there wasn't a dry eye among the spectators. Even the judge paused before issuing her ruling, visibly moved. "Mr. Hendricks, your courage has made this neighborhood and our state stronger." The ruling came down hard. The HOA was dissolved. All pending fines were nullified. The board was stripped of authority, and the property deed boundaries were reaffirmed by the state's survey commission. Elaine, finally served with a subpoena, after weeks in hiding, was ordered to appear before a grand jury. And yet, despite the victory, James didn't smile. He simply walked out of the courthouse, returned to his truck, and drove home to the lake. He stood at the edge of the dock, watching the water ripple under the afternoon breeze, and let himself breathe. Not because it was over, but because for the first time in a long time he wasn't alone in the fight. The silence that followed the dissolution of the Lakeview Reserve HOA was not the peaceful kind James Hendricks had once longed for. It was the kind that comes before a storm, loaded with tension and unfinished business. Though the board had been stripped of its power and the court had ruled definitively in James's favor, the remnants of the HOA still clung to life like weeds after a hard rain. Elaine Tucker had finally been cornered by state investigators, forced out of hiding, when her assets were frozen and her attorney dropped her case mid-hearing citing ethical conflicts. She was now under formal investigation for a list of charges that ranged from falsifying community records to orchestrating acts of intimidation against private residents. But instead of remorse or retreat, Elaine seemed to grow more erratic. She began releasing public statements through social media accounts, some verified, others questionably fake, where she portrayed herself as a victim of political sabotage. Her language shifted from legal defense to unhinged conspiracy. "They are dismantling the fabric of good American neighborhoods," she wrote in one post, overlaying an image of her standing in front of the Lakeview entrance sign with the word Patriot digitally added beneath her name. In another, she claimed she had inside knowledge of corruption within the Attorney General's office and promised to reveal everything in due time. James, watching from the outside, knew this was her final tactic. When you lose structure, burn the rulebook. Her last weapon was to create such confusion and noise that the truth would get buried under the weight of her outrage. But James was prepared. Every lie she posted, every half-baked allegation, was quietly documented, archived, and sent to the authorities. He didn't engage publicly. He didn't respond to provocation. He let her scream into the void while he worked on rebuilding the community she had tried to destroy. With the HOA disbanded, residents were free to coordinate their own neighborhood events, maintain their properties as they saw fit, and most importantly, speak without fear. James worked with a small group of neighbors to create a voluntary neighborhood alliance, not a governing body, but a communication forum. They met monthly at the library, shared updates on community news, and organized potlucks, holiday decorations, and even a lakeside cleanup project. The difference was night and days. There were no fines, no inspections, just neighbors helping neighbors. James was asked to lead the group, but he refused, suggesting instead a rotating facilitator role. "We've had enough of permanent power," he said, and the others nodded in agreement. Meanwhile, Elaine's situation grew more dire. The state's audit uncovered evidence that she had diverted thousands of dollars into personal accounts disguised as consulting fees. She had created shell companies to bill the HOA for services never rendered, landscaping contracts with no crews, maintenance firms with no licenses, and legal consultation fees paid to entities she privately controlled. The total estimated theft exceeded $180,000. She was arrested one morning just outside a grocery store 2 towns over, wearing sunglasses and a scarf and attempting to use a credit card flagged by investigators. The photo of her being led into a squad car, shoulders slumped and expression hollow, made the evening news. But James didn't celebrate. There were still others like her out there, other HOAs led by people with similar thirsts for control, operating unchecked under layers of bureaucracy, and that knowledge haunted him. He began corresponding with advocates and attorneys across the country who were working on legislative reform. He provided testimony to a task force forming a new statewide oversight commission on HOA accountability. He shared his story at closed-door meetings, never for fame, only for progress. And people listened. Laws began to change. Cities started requiring HOA financial disclosures and regular audits. Anonymous reporting portals were launched to protect residents from retaliation. One day, James received a letter from a woman in Arizona whose husband had been fined into foreclosure by an HOA that cited him for the placement of his wheelchair ramp. "We thought no one would believe us," she wrote. "Then we read your story. Thank you for not backing down." The letter stayed on James's desk for weeks. He read it over and over, reminding himself why he'd stood firm when it would have been easier to move, to settle, to disappear. But not all responses were supportive. He received threatening voicemails, unsigned letters with vague warnings, even a package filled with shredded paper and a fake citation stamped enforced by the people. One message read simply, "Stay quiet or lose more than your doc." It had no return address. James handed it to his contact at the federal office, who shrugged grimly and said, "Same playbook, new actors." Still, James pressed on. He held a small ceremony at the lake one Sunday morning with friends and longtime neighbors. They planted a tree by the shoreline in memory of the community's struggle, not a memorial of pain, but a symbol of resilience. The plaque beneath it read, "Here we stood, and here we stayed." As the wind blew across the water and children played nearby without fear, James stood quietly beside the tree and closed his eyes. For a moment, he could hear his grandfather's voice, distant but steady, telling him to take care of the land, to protect it, to never let anyone steal what was earned through hard work and love. That night, he slept without reaching for the gun on his nightstand. He dreamed of a lake untouched by paperwork, of a dock creaking softly under his boots, and of a community that remembered who they were before it all went wrong. But even in dreams, he knew vigilance was a lifelong duty. Because people like Elaine didn't vanish, they waited, they regrouped, they found new neighborhoods, new titles, new clipboards, and James knew that if she or anyone like her returned to Lakeview or anywhere else, there would be someone ready to stand against them, not with anger, not with revenge, but with truth, with patience, with everything he'd learned from the fight he never asked for, but never ran from. That was James Hendricks's legacy, not just keeping his land, but restoring what it meant to be part of a neighborhood. It was late summer when the last hearing took place, a final procedural formality where James Hendricks appeared before a joint oversight committee to help finalize the state reforms born from the chaos at Lakeview Reserve. He wore a collared shirt, jeans, and the calm expression of a man who had been through fire and walked out stronger. The courtroom was quiet as he took his seat and delivered testimony, not emotional, not bitter, just honest. He described how it began, with letters and citations and HOA rules that didn't apply to him, how it escalated through threats, false legal action, and even sabotage. He described the psychological toll, the vandalism, the explosion in his mailbox, and the moments when he nearly packed up and left. But he didn't. Because if I had, he told the room, it wouldn't have ended with me. They would have done it to the next neighbor, and the next. The cost of peace shouldn't be silence. When he finished, the committee thanked him. The lead senator called him a model of civic bravery. The reforms were passed unanimously the next day. That should have been the end of it, and for most of the community it was. The Lakeview Reserve neighborhood began to blossom as gang gardens reappeared. Families hosted front yard cookouts, and people painted their homes without fear of being fined for choosing the wrong shade of blue. The voluntary neighborhood group James helped start evolved into a true community circle, hosting town cleanups, charity events, and even a little league team named the Dock. James didn't take credit for any of it. He simply showed up, brought tools when needed, and waved to children who rode past on bikes. Occasionally, someone would ask if he was that guy from the lake story, and he'd nod politely, change the subject, and get back to work. His property, once a battleground, returned to being a sanctuary. The dock was refinished, the shed repainted, and his porch adorned with a rocking chair that overlooked the water. He found peace again, but not the kind that comes from forgetting. It was the kind that comes from knowing you fought for something and won. Still, reminders of what had happened occasionally surfaced. A news outlet did a Where Are They Now? Segment that showed a brief clip of Elaine Tucker, now residing in a small apartment several towns over. Her assets had been seized, her professional reputation destroyed, and her name permanently attached to one of the most infamous HOA scandals in state history. She declined interviews, citing ongoing legal matters, and was reportedly living under supervision due to the felony plea she eventually took. James didn't watch the segment. He didn't need to. He had already made peace with the end of her story. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line and cast orange streaks across the lake, James found an envelope wedged under the flower pot on his porch. No return address, no handwriting on the front. Inside was a folded letter typed, unsigned. It read, "You never knew what it was like trying to control chaos. I thought I was protecting the neighborhood, but maybe I was protecting my own illusion. I hope one day someone remembers me for more than how it ended. You won. I accept that." He sat with it for a while, the letter in one hand, a cold drink in the other, until the cicadas began to sing and the sky turned violet. Then he folded it again, tucked it into a drawer, and let it be. Closure wasn't about apologies, it was about the absence of conflict, the stillness that came after the noise. Weeks later, James helped organize a town-wide forum for surrounding neighborhoods, sharing resources on how to challenge abusive HOAs, recognize signs of overreach, and push for transparency. He watched from the back as newer voices took the mic, people who had lived through their own HOA horror stories, who now had the tools to fight back. He smiled, knowing the movement had outgrown him. That was the goal. He didn't want to be a hero, he wanted to be a stepping stone. He got letters from attorneys, community leaders, even a few mayors asking for his insight. He responded when he could, but always reminded them that he was just a homeowner who said no when enough was enough. On the one-year anniversary of the HOA's dissolution, the neighborhood threw a lakefront celebration. There were fireworks, music, food trucks, and laughter that echoed across the water like a song no one wanted to end. James stood near the dock, sipping coffee, watching children race up and down the shoreline with sparklers. Someone handed him a framed photo taken during the court case, a shot of him walking out of the courthouse, shoulders square, eyes steady. Beneath it was a quote they'd pulled from his testimony: "The cost of peace shouldn't be silence." It was engraved in wood, subtle but powerful. He accepted it with a quiet nod and hung it in the hallway near his grandfather's photo. That night, as he lay in bed, windows open, the sound of the lake drifting in, James finally allowed himself to believe it was over. Not just the fight, but the fear. The house felt lighter. The air tasted cleaner. He drifted to sleep thinking not of courts, or fines, or the chaos Elaine had brought, but of early mornings on the dock, of coffee with the mist rising from the water, and of what it meant to truly feel at home. And in that sleep, there were no warnings, no shadows, no battles waiting on the other side of the dream. Only peace, and the knowledge that when it was needed, he had stood, and that was enough.